The city has two faces. One it shows to the world, the glittering skyline, the bustling streets, the facade of law and order. The other lies beneath, in the alleyways and high-rise boardrooms where handshakes are traded like currency and silence is more valuable than gold. This is where I work, somewhere between those two faces. My name is Jack Kane. Officially, I'm a detective with the Metro Police Department, the guy they call when a case gets too complicated, when it threatens to spill into the papers and make people nervous. But off the record, I clean up messes for the city's elite, the politicians, CEOs, and celebrities who run this place. The ones who can't afford bad press or a scandal getting out of hand. I don't take pride in it. It's not about the money or power. It's survival. This city eats the weak and chews up the righteous. I learned early that if you're going to stay afloat, you better know how to swim in the filth. I tell myself I'm doing good, balancing the scales where the justice system falls short. Sometimes the truth isn't enough to solve a case. Evidence disappears. Witnesses recant. A well-placed lie can save a life. But every time I cross that line, I feel it shift beneath my feet, moving me further from the man I thought I was supposed to be. This story isn't about the times I got it right. It's about the time I almost lost everything. It started with the body. They always do. Megan Whitfield was one of those people you read about in glossy magazines, brilliant, beautiful, and untouchable. She built a tech empire out of nothing and rubbed elbows with the mayor at charity galas. But no one's untouchable forever. When she turned up dead in her penthouse, the city went into a tailspin. The pressure came down hard and fast. Find the killer. Make it neat. Get it off the front page. Then my best friend Eric's name popped up. Eric Cross and I go way back. Old friends who grew apart but never fully drifted. Where I took the badge, he picked up a pen, writing hard-hitting exposés that pissed off all the right people. We disagreed on just about everything, but he was one of the few good men left in this city. The kind who didn't know how to bend. The kind who'd snap before he broke. So when his fingerprints showed up at the scene, I knew something wasn't right. They wanted me to close the case and call it a day. Put Eric's face on the news, let the court decide the rest. But loyalty doesn't let you look the other way. I owed Eric too much to believe he'd kill someone like Megan Whitfield. I owed him the truth, even if chasing it meant tearing apart the life I'd carefully built in the shadows. I thought I could control it. Keep it clean. I was wrong. What followed was a descent into the underbelly of the city, a place I knew too well. I found myself up against the very people I'd spent years protecting, the same ones who paid me to make their problems disappear. The deeper I dug, the more I realized Megan's murder was just the surface scratch of something much darker. In this city, justice doesn't come free. There's always a price. The question is, how much are you willing to pay? Chapter 1. Ghosts in the Penthouse. The call came in at 3:17 a.m. I was wide awake, sitting in the dim light of my kitchen, nursing the last few drops of scotch in a glass that hadn't seen water in days. Sleep was a luxury I rarely indulged in. Nights like this, I didn't even try. The city outside my window stretched endlessly, blinking and breathing like a living thing, the distant hum of traffic a reminder that while most slept, the undercurrent of shadows kept moving. I thought about ignoring it. No good news ever came at this hour. But when my phone rang at that time of night, it was usually one of two people, my lieutenant or someone from the other side of the line. The side I didn't write reports for. I answered on the third ring. Jack, it's Markham. Homicide at the Whitfield penthouse. Upper East. I straightened in my chair. Megan Whitfield wasn't just any victim. She was practically royalty in this city, founder of Whitfield Innovations, darling of the tech world, and a frequent flyer at every political fundraiser that mattered. Her name carried weight in circles that didn't like being disturbed, and the fact that Markham, my lieutenant, was calling me instead of sending the usual beat cops meant this was about to get complicated. I'm on it, I said, already grabbing my coat. The streets were quiet as I drove through the city. The rain had stopped hours ago, leaving behind slick pavement that glistened under the streetlights. I kept the windows down, letting the cold air bite at my skin. It kept me sharp. I didn't need to walk into Megan Whitfield's penthouse foggy or second-guessing myself. By the time I pulled up to the towering glass skyscraper that housed her penthouse, the place was already swarming with uniforms. Blue lights flashed against the reflective surfaces, painting the surrounding buildings in a cold, sterile glow. I flashed my badge at the officer manning the lobby. Detective Kane. Lieutenant Markham's expecting me. The officer gave a curt nod, directing me to the private elevator at the far end. As I stepped inside, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirrored walls, tired eyes, stubble too thick to pass as rugged, and the kind of expression that said I'd seen one too many crime scenes to let this one shake me. But something felt off. I could sense it in the air, even before the elevator doors slid open onto the 42nd floor. The hall outside the penthouse was too quiet. Most murder scenes hum with noise, officers talking, forensics at work, radios crackling. But this? It felt like everyone was holding their breath. Markham was waiting just inside the door, arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. "Hell of a mess in there," he muttered, leading me inside. The penthouse was a testament to excess. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, while modern art sculptures that probably cost more than my salary filled the open-concept living space. But all of that faded the moment I saw the body. Megan Whitfield lay sprawled on the marble floor near the grand piano, a single gunshot wound to the chest. Her silk dress was stained crimson, pooling beneath her like a morbid halo. There were no signs of struggle, no broken glass or overturned furniture. It was too clean. I crouched beside the body, careful not to disturb a scene. Her eyes were still open, staring blankly at the ceiling, lips slightly parted as if she'd been caught mid-sentence. "What do we know?" I asked. Markham stood over me, his voice low. Security cameras cut out an hour before the estimated time of death. Private security detail wasn't on site. She dismissed them 2 nights ago. Building security didn't hear a thing. The door was locked from the inside. I glanced at Megan's manicured hand. No defensive wounds. No signs she even saw it coming. "Robberies?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Nothing's missing. Jewelry, electronics, cash, all still here," Markham replied. This wasn't about money. I rose to my feet, letting my eyes sweep the room. There was something almost surgical about the whole thing. Megan Whitfield was too high-profile for this to be random. "Someone she knew," I muttered. Markham nodded. "That's our working theory. Forensics is still processing, but," he hesitated. "But what?" I pressed. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "We found fingerprints on the champagne glass near her body. Partial match came back about 20 minutes ago." I waited. "It's Eric Cross." I blinked, the name hitting harder than I expected. "You're sure?" Markham handed me the evidence report, the weight of the paper heavier than it should have been. Eric Cross wasn't just some random name in a database. He was my best friend. The precinct was quiet when I arrived, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound as I stepped into the interrogation room. Eric sat on the opposite side of the table, handcuffed but calm. He looked up when I entered, his eyes narrowing in confusion before recognition set in. "Jack," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Guess I shouldn't be surprised you're the one they sent." I didn't respond immediately. I pulled out the chair across from him, lowering myself into it slowly. The weight of unspoken words hung between us, but I didn't have the luxury of friendship tonight. "Want to tell me why your fingerprints were at the scene?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. Eric held my gaze, his expression unreadable. "I was there earlier in the evening. Megan and I were meeting about a story I was working on. We had a few drinks. I left around 10. I leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. "Security cameras were down, Eric. You expect me to believe that's a coincidence?" His jaw tightened. "I didn't kill her, Jack." "Then why didn't you tell me you were investigating her?" Eric exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Because I knew you'd try to talk me out of it. Megan wasn't as clean as everyone thought. She was running some shady deals behind the scenes. I was close to exposing her." I stared at him, searching for cracks in his story. "You're telling me she was corrupt?" Eric nodded. She was laundering money through shell companies connected to half the city's power players. I didn't have all the pieces yet, but I was getting close. And you think that got her killed? He hesitated. I don't know. But I do know I didn't pull the trigger. I wanted to believe him. Hell, part of me already did. But the facts weren't lining up, and in my line of work, believing someone didn't stop bullets from flying. Eric, you need to give me something more. The brass wants a suspect, and right now, all the evidence points to you. He met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw fear flicker behind his eyes. I didn't kill her, Jack. But someone wants it to look like I did. And that was the moment I realized the case wasn't just about Megan Whitfield. It was about me. I sat across from Eric, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a loaded gun against my back. He looked the same as he always had, calm under pressure, a little too self-assured for someone handcuffed to a metal table. But I knew him better than that. His eyes gave him away. The flicker of fear he tried to hide wasn't for show. Still, fear didn't make him innocent. You've got to give me more, I said, keeping my voice even. Right now, all I've got is your word. That won't stop them from charging you? Eric let out a short, humorless laugh. You really think they're going to let me walk out of here because I said I didn't do it? Come on, Jack. This isn't your first rodeo. He wasn't wrong. Cases like this, high-profile, media-ready, didn't leave much room for doubt. The department wanted it tied up with a neat little bow, and Eric was the perfect scapegoat. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. I can stall them for a day, maybe two. But if I don't come up with something better, they're going to book you. Eric met my eyes, something dark flashing behind his calm facade. I don't need you to stall, Jack. I need you to find who actually killed Megan. I hated how easily he said it, like it was that simple. Like I could snap my fingers and solve the damn thing overnight. You're asking a lot, I muttered. Eric's gaze sharpened. I'm asking you to do your job. I didn't respond right away. My job, as far as the department was concerned, was to close this case. And if the evidence said Eric Cross was guilty, then I was supposed to put him away. But we both knew that wasn't how I operated. I pushed back my chair and stood, tapping twice on the table. Don't go anywhere. Not like I have a choice, Eric quipped, lifting his cuffed hands. I stepped out into the dim hallway, closing the interrogation room door behind me. Markham was waiting, leaning against the wall like he'd been listening through the glass. Well, he asked, one brow raised. I shook my head. He's not our guy? Markham grunted. You sure about that? No. But you're going to act like you are, he said knowingly. I met his gaze. Eric's not a killer. Someone's setting him up, and until I figure out who, I'm not letting him take the fall. Markham studied me for a long moment, then sighed. You've got 48 hours. After that, if you don't have something solid, I'm cutting him loose or charging him. I don't care which. Fair enough, I said, already walking toward the exit. The scene of the crime. The Whitfield penthouse was still sealed off when I returned, though most of the uniforms had cleared out. Only a few forensic techs remained, dusting for prints and collecting what little evidence hadn't already been bagged and tagged. I flashed my badge to the officer at the door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of bleach, an unsettling contrast to the faint metallic tang of blood that still lingered near the grand piano where Megan's body had been found. I moved slowly through the space, letting my eyes drift over every detail. The place was pristine, almost too pristine. For someone as high-profile as Megan Whitfield, there should have been more signs of life. Half-empty wine glasses, scattered papers, anything. But it felt staged, like a showroom nobody had actually lived in. Near the bar, I found the champagne glass Markham had mentioned. A small evidence marker sat next to it. I crouched, staring at the faint fingerprint dust smeared along the rim. Eric's print. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos of the crime scene taken earlier. One image caught my attention. The glass wasn't there when Megan's body was first photographed. Someone had placed it there later. I frowned, standing slowly as I pieced it together. Someone wanted Eric's print to be found, which meant someone else had been here after Megan was killed. I turned toward the balcony, stepping outside. The cold night air bit at my skin as I leaned on the railing. The view stretched endlessly, the city's lights shimmering below like stars scattered across asphalt. Someone out there knew exactly what had happened to Megan. And I was going to find them. Old friends, new enemies. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. By the time the sun broke over the skyline, I was back at the precinct, hunched over a pile of files on Megan Whitfield. Her life was immaculate on paper, charitable donations, business awards, and a spotless public image. But the deeper I dug, the more cracks I found. Whispers of shady deals, bribes quietly swept under the rug, and connections to some of the city's less-than-savory figures. Nothing solid, but enough to make me question the picture-perfect facade. By noon, I had a name. Vincent Graves. A real estate mogul with enough ties to dirty money to build a bridge made of skeletons. Megan had done business with him a year ago, and shortly after, rumors swirled that she was looking to cut ties. Graves didn't take kindly to being crossed. I grabbed my coat and headed out. Meeting with Graves. Vincent Graves operated out of a high-rise downtown, his office perched at the very top like a vulture watching over the city. I didn't bother making an appointment. The receptionist barely had time to protest before I was pushing through the heavy oak doors into Graves' sprawling office. He was there, standing by the window with a glass of whiskey in hand. He didn't look surprised to see me. "Detective Kane," Graves said smoothly, turning to face me. "To what do I owe the pleasures?" I didn't bother with pleasantries. "Megan Whitfield's dead. I think you know something about that." Graves raised a brow, sipping his drink. "Tragic, isn't it? But I'm afraid you'll have to be more specific." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "I know Megan was planning to cut ties with you. And I know you don't take rejection lightly." Graves chuckled, setting his glass down. "Detective, if I killed everyone who inconvenienced me, I'd have run out of business partners years ago." His eyes darkened slightly, and I caught the veiled threat beneath his polished words. "I didn't kill Megan," he continued. "But if you're smart, you'll stop poking around where you don't belong. You might not like what you find." I held his gaze for a long moment before stepping back. "This isn't over," I said, turning for the door. Graves' voice followed me out. "It never is." Chapter 2, Threads in the Dark. The city stretched out beneath me as I drove away from Vincent Graves' office, its glittering lights mocking the shadows I was about to crawl through. Graves hadn't pulled the trigger, but his smirk told me he knew exactly who did. The rich didn't need to get their hands dirty, they paid people like me to do that for them. But this time, I wasn't for sale. I took the long way back to the precinct, letting the silence simmer as I pieced things together. Megan Whitfield had enemies. That much was obvious. But Eric wasn't one of them. Someone had gone through a lot of trouble to set him up, and if it wasn't Graves, then it was someone in Megan's orbit, someone close enough to plant evidence without raising suspicion. I didn't like how that narrowed the list. By the time I pulled into the precinct garage, the clock was pushing 8 p.m. The place was half empty, the graveyard shift just beginning to shuffle in. I made my way upstairs, cutting through the bullpen toward my office. Claire Novak was waiting outside my door. She was leaning against a frame, arms crossed, her tailored suit as crisp as ever. Claire had been Eric's defense attorney once upon a time, and we'd worked a few cases together since. She had a sharp tongue and sharper instincts, and right now, the look she shot me said she wasn't here for small talk. "Let me guess," I said as I approached. "You're here about Eric." She pushed off the wall, straightening. "I just got off the phone with Markham. He says Eric's prints were found at the scene." "Is it true?" I nodded, unlocking the door. "Come in." She followed me inside, shutting the door behind her. I dropped into the chair behind my desk, while she remained standing, pacing in front of me like a caged animal. "Eric didn't kill Megan," she said, not bothering to sugarcoat it. "I know." That made her stop pacing. "Then why the hell is he still in holding?" I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands behind my head. "Because someone's setting him up. And I don't have enough to clear him yet." Claire frowned. "So, what do you have?" "Not much." I glanced at the file on my desk. Megan was involved in something shady before she died. Graves hinted at it, but he's not talking. I need more. Claire crossed her arms. And you think Eric's investigation into her has something to do with it? It's a start, I admitted. Eric said he was close to exposing her. That could be motive for someone else. Claire's gaze softened slightly, and she finally took a seat across from me. Jack, Eric trusts you. But you know as well as I do that trust doesn't mean much if the evidence keeps piling up. If you can't clear him soon, the DA is going to run with what they have. I rubbed a hand down my face. I've got 48 hours. Then you'd better make the most of it. Old records, new leads. After Claire left, I spent the next few hours sifting through Eric's files. He'd been digging into Megan's company for the past 6 months, tracing her connections to off-the-books deals and unnamed accounts. The records were dense, but one name popped up more than once: Caleb Voss. Voss was a fixer, the kind of guy you called when blackmail wasn't enough and violence was too risky. If Megan was involved with Voss, it meant she was in deeper trouble than I thought. I pulled out my phone and dialed an old number. After 3 rings, a familiar gravelly voice answered. "This is Voss." "It's Kane," I said. "We need to talk." Silence. "Jack Kane," Voss said slowly, like he was savoring the name. "I heard you were still playing detective. Thought you'd traded that in for fixing problems the easy way." "I'm not here to reminisce," I replied. "I need to know what you were doing with Megan Whitfield before she died." Voss chuckled. "And what makes you think I'd tell you that?" "Because if I have to come find you, I won't be asking nicely." There was a pause, then Voss sighed. "Fine. Meet me at the old rail yard in an hour." The rail yard was as abandoned as ever, rusted train cars lining the tracks like relics from a forgotten era. Voss was waiting near one of the sheds, leaning against a black sedan. He looked exactly the same, lean, weathered, and dangerous in that quiet, understated way that made men like him successful. "You always did like the dramatic meetups," I said, approaching. Voss shrugged. "Habit." I cut straight to the point. "Megan Whitfield. What was your connection to her?" Voss glanced around, then gestured for me to follow him inside the shed. The interior was dark, lit only by a flickering overhead bulb. Voss pulled out a cigarette, lighting it with the kind of slow precision that said he wasn't in a rush. "She hired me 6 months ago," he said finally. "Said she needed someone to handle a situation quietly. Paid well." "What kind of situation?" Voss exhaled a stream of smoke. "She wanted dirt on Vincent Graves. Thought he was skimming money from a joint investment project. That caught me off guard." "She was investigating him?" Voss nodded. "But she wasn't the only one. Someone else was keeping tabs on her. I warned her to back off, but she didn't listen." I frowned. "Who was watching her?" Voss hesitated. "I don't know. But whoever it was, they were good. Professional. The kind of people you don't want knowing your name." The pieces were starting to fit. Megan had been digging into Graves, but someone else had been digging into her. And now Eric was caught in the middle of it. I stepped closer to Voss. "You have any idea who killed her?" He shook his head. "But if I had to guess? Graves knows more than he's letting on. Megan had something on him, and I think he panicked." I nodded, already turning to leave. "Kane," Voss called after me. "Careful with this one. People like Graves don't play fair." I didn't need the warning. I'd already learned that the hard way. Part 2. The Web Tightens. I returned to the precinct just after midnight, the bullpen empty except for a few tired officers finishing up paperwork. I bypassed my office and headed straight for the evidence locker. The security guard at the desk looked up as I approached. "Detective Kane," he greeted. "What can I do for you?" "I need access to the Whitfield case files." "Now?" The guard hesitated, then nodded, sliding the key card through the reader. The door buzzed, and I stepped inside. I went straight to the box labeled Whitfield, homicide. Inside were the usual items: photos, forensics reports, and sealed bags of evidence. But one item caught my attention immediately. A laptop. Megan's personal computer. I carried the box to an empty desk, booting up the laptop with a sigh. A password screen appeared. "Of course," I muttered. I glanced through the evidence file until I found what I was looking for: Megan's date of birth. I keyed it in. The laptop unlocked. Files and folders filled the screen, most of them ordinary. But one folder stood out. It was labeled Project V. I clicked it open, my heart rate quickening. Inside were documents, emails, and financial records. And at the center of it all was Vincent Graves' name. Megan had been building a case against him. And now she was dead for it. Chapter 3. The Weight of Old Debts. The rain started falling the moment I stepped out of the hollow, thin and cold, like the city was trying to wash itself clean of the filth that lived inside places like that. It wasn't working. Graves and Voss thought they'd shut me down. They thought dropping a few veiled threats and smirking through their lies would scare me off. Maybe they were right about most cops, the kind who look the other way for the right price. But I wasn't most cops. I'd never been good at letting things go. The drive back to my apartment was slow. The city was half asleep, and the streets glistened under flickering streetlights. I rolled the window down, letting the rain creep in, hoping the cold air might clear the static buzzing in my head. Megan Whitfield was gone, but her shadow was long, stretching across people like Graves, Voss, and Eric. I'd seen setups before, but this one had too many moving pieces. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure Eric's fingerprints ended up on that glass. I parked outside my building and lingered for a moment, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes looked as tired as I felt, but I couldn't shut this thing down.
Not now.
I pocketed the flash drive with Megan's files and headed upstairs. The second I stepped into my apartment, I knew I wasn't alone. The lights were off, but a faint, smoky scent hung in the air, something expensive, something Graves or his people would wear. I didn't reach for my gun. Not yet. I flicked on the lamp by the couch. Caleb Voss was sitting there, legs crossed like he'd been waiting for me all night. A cigarette dangled from his fingers, the tip glowing faintly in the low light. "You really need to get better locks, Jack," Voss said, his eyes flicking toward me with a lazy grin. "Anyone could just walk right in." "I doubt you knocked," I replied, shutting the door behind me. Voss shrugged. "Didn't seem necessary." I leaned against the kitchen counter, keeping the distance between us. "You here to threaten me again? Or is this a social call?" "Neither," Voss said, tapping ash into an empty mug on the table. "I came to offer you a deal." I raised a brow. "A deal?" Voss's grin widened. "You're too close, Jack. Graves doesn't like it. Neither do the people he works for."
But me? I'm a reasonable guy.
"I don't mind bending the rules." "Let me guess," I said. "You keep Eric locked up, and in return, I get to keep breathing?" Voss chuckled. "Something like that. Graves wants this thing buried. Eric takes the fall, everyone moves on. And you walk away clean." I met his gaze, searching for any sign of sincerity. There wasn't much. "What makes you think I'd go for that?" I asked. Voss leaned forward, stubbing out his cigarette. His eyes darkened. "Because the alternative isn't pretty. You keep digging, you're going to find things that don't want to be found. And trust me, Jack, if you force Graves' hand, he won't stop at threats." I let the silence stretch between us, weighing his words. "You done?" I asked finally. Voss stood, straightening his coat. "Think about it. But don't take too long. Eric's running out of time." He paused at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. "Some advice, Kane. Sometimes it's better to lose one fight than the whole war." The door clicked shut behind him. Sleep wasn't happening that night. I spent the next few hours sifting through the files again, cross-referencing Megan's notes with old case records Graves had been involved in. A pattern emerged: land acquisitions, hostile takeovers, and bribes disguised as charitable donations. Vanguard Acquisitions wasn't just a front. It was a laundering operation. Megan had been on the verge of exposing it, and Graves had every reason to make sure she stayed quiet. But one document caught my eye. It wasn't about Graves. It was about Eric. A record of a payment, $50,000, wired to Eric's account 6 months ago from Vanguard Acquisitions. I stared at the screen, pulse quickening. Eric hadn't mentioned that. I grabbed my coat. It was time to ask him why. The precinct was quiet by the time I arrived. Markham had gone home, and most of the bullpen was empty. I made my way to holding, where Eric was sitting behind bars, arms crossed as he stared at the ceiling. He glanced up when I approached. "Back already?" he asked, standing and moving to the bars. I didn't bother with small talk. I held up the document. "Explain this." Eric's eyes flicked to the paper, and his expression shifted, subtle, but enough for me to notice. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice tightening. "Megan's files," I replied. "She kept everything." Eric exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," I said, stepping closer. Eric hesitated, glancing at the guard stationed at the far end of the room. I followed his gaze and waved the guard off. Once we were alone, Eric lowered his voice. "I took the money to protect Megan," he admitted. I frowned. "Protect her from what?" "Graves," Eric said. "She was getting too close. He made her an offer. Back off, and he'd cut her in. She refused. But I knew she was in danger, so I took the money and told Graves I'd make sure Megan stopped digging. I thought I could keep her safe." I stared at him, the weight of his confession sinking in. "You lied to her?" Eric nodded slowly.
Yeah.
"I thought I was buying time. I didn't think they'd actually kill her." His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time, I saw genuine guilt in his eyes.
"You should have told me," I said.
Eric met my gaze. Would it have changed anything? I didn't have an answer. Voss was right. I was too close. But now, there was no turning back. Eric wasn't innocent, but he wasn't a killer. Graves was still out there, and as long as he was breathing, this wasn't over. I left the precinct with a single thought burning in my mind. It was time to make Graves bleed. I drove aimlessly after leaving the precinct, the city blurring past as rain drummed against the windshield. Eric's confession kept replaying in my head, each word heavier than the last. He hadn't killed Megan, but he'd let his guard down, thinking he could outplay men like Graves. He should have known better. By the time I pulled up outside my apartment, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. I stepped out, scanning the street automatically. Nothing seemed out of place, but I wasn't naive. Graves wouldn't let things slide just because I hadn't folded the first time. I was running on fumes, but sleep wasn't happening anytime soon. I headed upstairs and slipped inside, locking the door behind me. The flash drive from Megan's laptop sat on the kitchen table where I'd left it. I poured a stiff drink, sat down, and plugged it back in. The files were as I left them: spreadsheets, email chains, and voice memos Megan had recorded. But something I missed earlier caught my eye. A hidden folder. It was buried under layers of encrypted data, but Megan had been smart enough to leave breadcrumbs for herself. I followed them, bypassing the encryption until the folder opened. Inside were surveillance photos. Eric. He was meeting with Graves, shaking hands outside the hollow. Another showed him entering a nondescript office building, one that I recognized as Vanguard Acquisitions headquarters. "Damn it, Eric," I muttered under my breath. There were more. Photos of Megan at various locations, meetings, fundraisers, and one particularly interesting shot. She was standing outside the old harbor district, talking to someone. The angle obscured the other person's face, but the figure was tall, wearing a long coat. I zoomed in, enhancing the image as best as I could. The man wasn't Graves. It was Caleb Voss. I didn't wait until morning. By 3 a.m., I was parked outside a rundown bar near the docks, one of Voss's usual haunts when he wasn't doing Graves' dirty work. The place was almost empty, save for a few drunks nursing cheap liquor and broken dreams. Voss was in the corner, alone, sipping something darker than whiskey. He glanced up as I approached, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips. "You're persistent," he said, swirling his glass. "I'll give you that." I dropped the surveillance photo on the table in front of him. "What were you doing with Megan at the harbor district?" Voss didn't even blink. He glanced at the photo, then leaned back casually. "She reached out," he replied. "Wanted to cut a deal. Said she had leverage over Graves and wanted to trade it for protection. And you?" I pressed. "I listened," Voss said, shrugging. "But I knew better than to get between her and Graves. I told her to walk away." "You didn't seem too worried when Graves ordered the hit," I snapped, narrowing my eyes. Voss leaned forward, his tone dropping. I didn't kill her, Kane. And I sure as hell didn't sign off on it. I warned Megan, but she didn't listen. She thought she could handle Graves on her own. I studied him, searching for cracks in his story. If you didn't kill her, I said slowly, then who did? Voss hesitated. That was new. Someone else was watching her, he admitted. Graves wasn't the only one keeping tabs. I don't know who they were, but I know they weren't local. Out-of-town talent. Quiet. Efficient. That sent a chill down my spine. Hired killers from outside the city meant one thing. This was bigger than a local power grab. You got a name? I asked. Voss shook his head. Only a code name. Spectre? I'd heard it before. A ghost in the underworld, someone you hired when you wanted zero traces. Spectre didn't leave loose ends. If Spectre was involved, I muttered, why frame Eric? Voss sipped his drink, considering the question. Leverage, he said finally. You were close to Eric. Graves figured if Eric went down, you'd back off. I clenched my jaw. Well, Graves miscalculated. Voss's smirk returned. I told him as much. I left the bar knowing one thing. I wasn't just up against Graves anymore. I was staring down Spectre, and if the rumors were true, they wouldn't stop until the trail was dead. By the time the sun came up, I was back at the precinct, watching Eric pace inside his holding cell. His nerves were frayed, and after last night's revelation, mine weren't far behind. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Morning, Eric muttered, slumping onto the bench. You look like hell. Yeah, well, so do you. I shot back. He glanced up, frowning. You found something. I slid the photo of Voss and Megan across the table. Eric's eyes widened slightly as he recognized the scene. She came to Voss? He asked, visibly shaken. She was desperate, I replied. She thought she could outplay Graves by striking a deal with his right-hand man. Eric's fists clenched. I didn't know, he whispered. I believe you, I said. But there's more. Voss says an out-of-town hitter was watching Megan, someone by the name of Spectre. Eric's head snapped up. Spectre? Jack, that's not just a rumor. Spectre's the real deal. A ghost. If they're involved. I know, I cut in. It means this isn't about Graves anymore. Someone higher up wants this buried. Eric exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I'm screwed. Aren't I? Not yet, I replied. But we need leverage. Something that'll force Graves to give up Spectre's name. Eric met my gaze, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. There's a file, he said slowly. Megan gave it to me right before she died. I didn't think much of it at the time, but she said it was insurance. I hid it. Where? I asked, pulse quickening. Eric hesitated. At her lake house. The safe in her study. Code's her birthday. I stood abruptly. That's our next move. As I left the holding cell, I knew one thing for sure. The lake house wouldn't be empty. Chapter 4, The Lake House. The road to Megan Whitfield's lake house twisted like a snake through the dense woods outside the city. The further I drove, the thinner the trees became, giving way to glimpses of the water through the branches. It was early afternoon, but the overcast sky made it feel like dusk. The lake mirrored the dark clouds, the entire place draped in a suffocating stillness. Eric's directions had been clear. Megan's lake house sat at the end of a gravel road that most people wouldn't stumble across unless they were looking for it. As I pulled up to the wrought iron gate, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had already beaten me here. I killed the engine and stepped out, gravel crunching beneath my boots. The house stood 2 stories tall, its dark cedar siding blending into the woods behind it. Megan hadn't built it to impress anyone. This place was for solitude. A sanctuary. Now it was a crime scene waiting to happen. The gate was unlocked. That was my first sign. I slipped through quietly, hand drifting toward the grip of the gun holstered beneath my coat. The air was heavy, thick with the damp scent of rain-soaked pine. No signs of movement. Not yet. The front door hung slightly ajar, rocking gently in the wind. Sign 2. I drew my gun and stepped inside. The entryway was dark, but I didn't bother flipping on the lights. I didn't want to announce myself. The place was neat. Too neat. Photos of Megan and her family lined the mantel above the stone fireplace, untouched. A coffee mug sat on the kitchen counter, a book left open on the living room table. It was staged, like someone had wanted it to look lived in, but the atmosphere told a different story. I moved cautiously through the downstairs, clearing each room as I went. Empty. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked under my weight as I climbed the narrow staircase. Megan's study was at the end of the hall. The door was shut, but faint light bled out from the crack beneath it. Sign 3. I flattened against the wall, gun raised. Someone was in there. Slowly, I twisted the handle and nudged the door open. A man stood in front of Megan's desk, rifling through drawers with gloved hands. His silhouette was lean, dressed in dark tactical gear. He heard me too late. "Don't move," I said, stepping inside with my gun aimed at the back of his head. The intruder froze, his shoulders tensing. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint rustling of trees outside the window. "Turn around. Hands where I can see them." The man slowly complied, raising his gloved hands as he pivoted. My heart rate kicked up a notch. It wasn't just anyone. It was Caleb Voss. "Well," Voss said, lowering his hands slightly. "Guess I should have known you'd show up." I kept the gun steady. "Funny, I was just thinking the same thing." Voss offered a lazy smirk. "I was just cleaning up some loose ends. You know how it is." I gestured with the gun. "Step away from the desk." He complied, moving slowly to the side. I glanced toward the desk and immediately spotted what he'd been searching for, the safe built into the wall behind it. The steel door was halfway open. "You're sloppy tonight," I said, keeping one eye on Voss. "Normally you're more careful." "I wasn't expecting company," he replied, his smirk fading. "But you can't blame me for being curious." I stepped to the safe, peering inside. A thin black folder sat at the center, along with a USB drive and several loose papers. I didn't touch anything. "Is this what Graves sent you for?" I asked. Voss shook his head. "Graves didn't send me. I came for myself." I raised a brow. "You're lying?" He shrugged. "Maybe." I stepped toward him, lowering the gun slightly, but keeping it ready.
"Why, Voss?"
"Megan's dead. Graves got what he wanted. Why are you still here?" Voss's smirk twisted into something darker. "Because Graves is scared, Kane. And when Graves gets scared, people like me get nervous." I frowned. "Scared of what?" Voss's eyes flicked toward the safe. "That," he said simply. I took the folder from the safe and flipped it open. Inside were printed emails, financial records, and one very interesting name at the center of it all. Senator Alan Rourke. I felt the air leave my lungs. Rourke was one of the most powerful men in the state, clean, untouchable, and ambitious enough to have his eyes on Washington. If Megan had dirt on him, it explained everything. "She was blackmailing Rourke," I muttered, piecing it together aloud. "That's why she was killed." Voss nodded. "Graves didn't sign the order. He just made the introductions. Rourke called the shot." I stared at the papers, my mind racing. Eric hadn't been the target. Megan was sitting on information that could burn half the city to the ground. Rourke couldn't let that happen, so he hired Spectre to make sure she stayed quiet. Voss shifted slightly. I leveled the gun at him again. "You were here to destroy this," I said. He shrugged. "I was doing you a favor. This is the kind of thing that gets people killed." I stuffed the folder into my coat. "Not tonight." Voss smirked. "I figured you'd say that." We stared each other down for a long moment before he raised his hands in mock surrender. "I'm done here, Kane. But be careful with that. You're not ready for the weight it carries." I didn't respond. Voss stepped past me, heading toward the door. He paused briefly, glancing back. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said quietly. "But I think you already know that." I kept the gun trained on him until he disappeared down the hall. The weight of the folder in my coat suddenly felt heavier than it should have. Voss was right about one thing. I wasn't ready for what came next. But I wasn't turning back either. The lake was still as glass when I stepped outside, but I felt anything but calm. The black folder weighed heavy inside my coat, pressing against my ribs like a loaded gun. Voss was gone. I watched his taillights vanish down the gravel road, but his words lingered like smoke in the cold air. You're not ready for the weight it carries. Maybe not. But it didn't matter now. The moment I stuffed that folder into my coat, I crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I climbed into the car and sat there, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I could turn around, drive back to the precinct, hand this over to Markham, and let him handle the fallout. But I wouldn't. Because Eric was still sitting in a cell, and I'd be damned if I let Graves and Rourke bury him with Megan. I started the engine and headed back toward the city. It was after midnight when I pulled into Eric's apartment complex. His place was a hole-in-the-wall one-bedroom he hadn't updated since the early 2000s, peeling wallpaper, second-hand furniture, and a fridge stocked with cheap beer and nothing else. I'd been here enough times to know where he kept the spare key. The lock clicked softly, and I stepped inside, careful not to disturb anything. I wasn't here to ransack the place. I was here to find leverage. If Eric had hidden the folder at Megan's lake house, chances were he kept backups elsewhere. I moved through the cramped living room, checking bookshelves and desk drawers. Nothing unusual. His laptop sat on the coffee table, but I didn't touch it. Eric was too smart to leave anything digital out in the open. I checked the bedroom next. That's when I found it. Tucked behind a loose floorboard near the bed frame was a flash drive wrapped in duct tape. I peeled it open carefully, holding the small device up to the light. Bingo! The precinct was quiet when I arrived. Night shift officers drifted in and out, and I slipped past them without drawing attention. Markham's office was dark. Good. I made my way to the evidence room, ducked inside, and plugged the flash drive into a station computer. A single folder appeared. Vanguard_work_confidential. I opened it, scanning through the files. Megan hadn't just been building a case. She'd been collecting evidence for months. Internal memos, wire transfers, surveillance photos of Rourke meeting with Graves, and at the center of it all, a contract signed by both men. Vanguard wasn't just a laundering front. It was the engine behind half the political corruption in the state. I scrolled further and froze. The last file was a recorded phone call. I clicked it open, Megan's voice crackling through the speakers. I know what you're doing, Graves. You think you can keep using Vanguard to funnel money without anyone noticing, but I have the paper trail. I know about Rourke, and if anything happens to me... A second voice interrupted her.
Graves.
Megan, stop. This isn't a game. Walk away now, and I'll let you... Let me? Megan scoffed. You don't have that kind of power, Graves. You're wrong. And you're making this harder than it needs to be. The recording ended abruptly. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding. This wasn't just leverage. This was a smoking gun. I left the evidence room and made my way to the holding cells. Eric was sitting on the bench, rubbing his eyes like he hadn't slept. He looked up when I approached. I hope you brought good news, he muttered. I pulled out the flash drive and held it up. Better than good. Eric's eyes widened slightly. Is that Megan's insurance policy? I confirmed. She didn't tell you she recorded the call? Eric exhaled sharply. She didn't trust anyone. Not even me. Smart woman, I said, unlocking his cell door. Eric frowned. Markham gave you the green light? Not exactly. He hesitated, eyes narrowing. Jack, if you walk me out of here without Markham's sign-off. It won't matter, I interrupted. Not once this gets out. Eric studied me for a long moment. You're playing a dangerous game. I smirked faintly. So are you? I led him out through the side entrance, avoiding unnecessary eyes. The last thing we needed was word getting back to Graves or Rourke that Eric was loose. As we stepped into the cool night air, Eric stopped, glancing around warily. You expecting someone? I asked. He shook his head. Just paranoid.
Good.
Stay that way. An hour later, we were sitting in a diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that didn't ask questions or care who you were. The flash drive sat on the table between us, untouched. You realize what happens when we release this, Eric said quietly, stirring his coffee. Rourke will bury you, Jack. You and me both. I know, I replied, sipping black coffee that tasted like burnt oil. But we're out of options. Eric leaned back, rubbing his face. I can take the drive to the press. Let them handle it. I shook my head.
No.
If anyone breaks this, it's me. I'm already in too deep to back out now. Eric sighed, looking like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Before I could say more, the diner's bell jingled as the door opened. I glanced up and froze. Vincent Graves stepped inside, alone. He scanned the room casually, then made his way to our booth. I didn't reach for my gun.
Not yet.
Mind if I join you? Graves asked smoothly. I gestured to the seat across from us. By all means. Graves slid in, eyeing the flash drive like it might bite him. You two are making a lot of noise, he said quietly. Rourke doesn't like noise. I don't care what Rourke likes, I replied. You're both going down for this. Graves chuckled, folding his hands. Jack, you don't win by burning everything to the ground. You win by knowing which fires to start and which ones to let burn out. I narrowed my eyes. What's your point? Graves leaned forward, lowering his voice. Rourke's not untouchable. But you don't need to take the whole machine down. Just cut the head off. I exchanged a glance with Eric. What are you offering? I asked cautiously. Graves smirked.
A name.
Spectre. And the evidence tying him to Megan's murder. I stared at him, sensing the trap. And in return, Graves' eyes darkened. You let Vanguard die quietly. Rourke takes the fall, and I walk away. Eric shifted uncomfortably, but I held Graves' gaze. I'll think about it. Graves grinned. Don't take too long. Chapter 5, Cutting the Head Off. The silence stretched across the booth like a taut wire, ready to snap. Vincent Graves leaned back in his seat, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Across from him, Eric shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking toward me, searching for some kind of cue. I didn't give him one. Graves had just handed me the one thing I needed most, Spectre's name and the evidence tying him to Megan's murder. It was the key to unraveling everything. But it came wrapped in poison. I wasn't naive. Letting Graves walk meant leaving a viper alive, one that could strike again the moment I let my guard down. But I had to be honest with myself. Rourke was the bigger threat. And the higher you climb, the harder the fall. Say I agree, I said, keeping my voice low. What happens to Eric? Graves' smirk didn't waver. Eric goes free. No charges, no loose ends. As far as the system is concerned, he was never involved. Eric's jaw tightened. And you walk away clean? Graves shrugged. Call it self-preservation. Rourke's been a useful ally, but he's dangerous when cornered. I'd rather see him fall than end up on the wrong side of this mess. I stared at him, weighing my options. This wasn't justice. It wasn't even close. It was survival, plain and simple. Give me Spectre's name, I said finally. Graves' smile faded. He nodded, reaching into his coat and sliding a thin envelope across the table. I didn't touch it immediately. You're sure this ties him directly to Megan? I asked. Graves' eyes narrowed. Trust me, Kane. I don't play games with Spectre. If Rourke paid him to kill Megan, it's in there. I slid the envelope into my coat without looking inside. If this burns me, Graves, I'll bury you myself. Graves' smirk returned. I wouldn't expect anything less. Without another word, he rose from the booth and disappeared into the rainy night, leaving Eric and me alone with the weight of the deal I'd just made. We sat in silence for a long while after Graves left. The diner's overhead lights buzzed faintly, and outside, rain trickled down the window in thin sheets. Eric finally broke the quiet. You trust him? No, I said flatly, but I trust his fear of Rourke. That's the only reason he gave us anything. Eric exhaled sharply, leaning back in his seat. We're playing with fire, Jack. Graves might have thrown Rourke under the bus, but that doesn't make him innocent. What happens when this is over? I met his gaze. One step at a time. First, we deal with Spectre. Eric frowned. And then, I hesitated. Then we deal with Graves. Eric studied me for a long moment, but didn't argue. He knew better than anyone that letting Graves walk wasn't part of my long-term plan. I opened the envelope carefully, pulling out a single sheet of paper. One name was printed at the top. Nicholas Holt. I froze. Son of a bitch, I muttered. Eric leaned over, glancing at the paper. You know him? Yeah, I said grimly. I know him. Nicholas Holt wasn't just a name on a list. He was ex-military, ex-intelligence, and the last person I ever expected to cross paths with again. I'd tangled with Holt years ago during an arms trafficking case that ended badly for everyone involved. He disappeared shortly after. I thought he was dead. Apparently, I was wrong. Tracking down Nicholas Holt wasn't going to be easy. He was a ghost, and ghosts didn't like being found. Eric and I returned to my apartment, where I spread Graves' files across the kitchen table. Most of it was clean bank statements, shell company records, and memos Graves used as leverage. But tucked near the bottom was an address. It wasn't Holt's home. Spectre didn't have one of those. It was a storage facility on the industrial side of town. A place where people like Holt kept things they didn't want others to find. This could be a trap, Eric warned as I grabbed my coat.
Probably, I replied.
But I'm going anyway. Eric stood abruptly. I'm coming with you. No, I said firmly. You need to keep your head down. If this goes south, you can't get caught in the middle of it. Eric clenched his fists but relented.
Fine.
But call me if you need backup. I nodded and stepped out into the night. By the time I reached the industrial district, the rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy with moisture. The storage facility was deserted, a series of rusted metal units stretching beneath flickering security lights. I parked near the gate, scanning the area carefully. Unit A-13. That was the one Graves listed. I moved quickly, cutting through the chain-link fence with bolt cutters and slipping inside. The unit wasn't hard to find. It sat at the end of the row, partially hidden by overgrown weeds and a rusted-out truck that hadn't moved in years. The lock had been busted. Someone else had been here recently. I pushed the door open slowly, gun drawn, and stepped inside. The space was small and cluttered with crates, but in the center of the room sat a folding table with a single black duffel bag resting on top. I approached carefully, unzipping the bag to reveal its contents. Inside were surveillance photos of Megan, the same ones Boss had mentioned, along with a suppressed pistol and several burner phones. But there was something else.
A dossier.
I opened it, flipping through the pages. Megan wasn't the only target. Eric's name was there, too. My blood ran cold. Holt hadn't just been hired to kill Megan. Rourke wanted Eric dead as well. I pocketed the dossier and turned to leave, but a figure stepped into the doorway, blocking my exit. Nicholas Holt. He stood there silently, dressed in dark tactical gear, his eyes calm and unreadable. Kane, Holt said quietly. You should have stayed out of this. I tightened my grip on the gun. Can't do that. Holt tilted his head slightly. You know how this ends? I leveled the gun at him.
Yeah.
I do. The standoff stretched, and for a brief second, neither of us moved. Then Holt smirked. I'll see you soon. Without another word, he vanished into the night. The rain had stopped by the time Eric and I left the diner, but the weight in my chest hadn't lifted. Graves had given me exactly what I wanted, Spectre's name, Nicholas Holt, but it felt too easy. Graves wasn't the type to give without expecting something in return. I drove in silence, the city lights bleeding across the windshield. Eric sat beside me, his gaze fixed on the street ahead, but I could tell his mind was spinning the same way mine was. Graves just handed you Spectre like it was nothing, Eric said finally. Doesn't that strike you as wrong? It's not wrong, I replied. It's calculated. Graves isn't helping us because he's scared. He's helping because he knows this buries Rourke. Eric exhaled sharply. So, we're just going to be his cleanup crew? I shook my head.
No.
We use Holt to get to Rourke, but when the dust settles, Graves goes down too. Eric didn't look convinced. Graves is a snake, Jack. If you leave him breathing, he'll slither his way back into power. He won't, I muttered. Eric stared at me for a long moment. You really believe that? I didn't answer. By the time we got back to the precinct, dawn was beginning to break, staining the sky in muted grays and blues. Markham was already at his desk, sipping coffee that looked strong enough to melt the mug. He glanced up when I entered. You look like hell, Kane, he said. I dropped the envelope Graves had given me onto his desk. That's Spector's name. Nicholas Holt. Ex-Intel, now freelancing as Rourke's hitman. Markham's brows furrowed as he flipped the envelope open and scanned the contents. You trust Graves on this? Markham asked skeptically. I don't trust Graves on anything, I replied, but the intel checks out. Markham set the papers down, rubbing his temples. This is bigger than I thought, he muttered. If Rourke's hiring guys like Holt to tie off loose ends, we're dealing with more than just dirty money. This could rip the department wide open. I nodded. That's the idea. Markham leaned back in his chair, eyeing me carefully. You're planning something, aren't you? I didn't blink. Yeah. Markham's gaze flicked to Eric, who had planted himself against the wall. You two think you can handle this?
We don't have a choice, I said.
Markham exhaled slowly, nodding.
Fine.
But if this goes sideways, I can't protect you. I know. The next move had to be fast. Eric and I worked out of my apartment that afternoon, poring over everything Graves had given us. Holt wasn't just hiding out. He was running Rourke's cleanup operation from a safe house on the edge of the industrial district. It wasn't much, but it was something. Graves said Holt's staying low, Eric said, glancing at the map we'd spread across the table. Security's tight. I'm not worried about security, I replied. I'm worried about getting there before Holt vanishes. Eric frowned. You really think Graves sold him out? Graves isn't an idiot, I muttered. He knows we'll handle Holt, and once Holt's out of the picture, Rourke's left twisting in the wind. It's a win-win for him. Eric ran a hand through his hair, eyes drifting toward the surveillance photos Graves had given us. I still don't like it, he said quietly. This feels like a setup. It probably is, I admitted. But we're out of options. Eric glanced at me, his jaw tight.
Fine.
But if Graves screws us, he dies first. I couldn't argue with that. Before we made a move on Holt, I needed backup. The kind of backup that didn't ask questions. I made a call to an old contact, Frank Delgado. Delgado wasn't a cop, not anymore. He used to work special ops before retiring to private security. Now he ran underground jobs for people who needed muscle, but couldn't go through official channels. He owed me. Frank picked up on the third ring.
Kane, he said.
It's been a while. I need a favor, I replied. You in town. For the right price, Frank said. What's the job? I hesitated. High risk. Could get messy. Frank chuckled. Aren't they always? Meet me at the docks tonight. I'll fill you in. Frank didn't ask questions. See you there? The harbor stretched out in front of us as night fell. The industrial area was mostly abandoned, save for a few warehouses and dock workers wrapping up late shipments. Eric and I sat in the car, watching the safe house from a distance. It was an old shipping warehouse, isolated from the main harbor. 2 guards stood by the entrance, hands tucked into their jackets, but there were probably more inside. Frank showed up right on time, climbing into the back seat with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. This the place? He asked, nodding toward the warehouse. Yeah, I replied.
Holt's in there.
We need him alive. Frank raised an eyebrow. Alive's harder. But I'll manage. Eric loaded his gun, checking the chamber. No screw-ups, he said, glancing at Frank. Holt gets away. We lose everything. Frank grinned. Relax, Cross. I'm a professional. We stepped out of the car, moving toward the warehouse like shadows cutting through the mist. I wasn't afraid of the guards. I was afraid of what waited inside. Tonight, we weren't just hunting Spector. We were setting fire to the entire system. Chapter 6, Fire with Fire. Nicholas Holt's footsteps faded into the night, but his presence lingered like a ghost. I stood alone in the rusted storage unit, staring at the surveillance photos of Eric. Megan's murder had been cold-blooded, but this was worse. Rourke wasn't satisfied with silencing Megan. He wanted Eric erased. I zipped the duffel bag shut and stepped out into the damp night air. Holt hadn't killed me when he had the chance. That wasn't mercy. It was a message. He wanted me to know he wasn't done yet. The drive back to the city felt longer than it should have. I parked 3 blocks from my apartment and walked the rest of the way, eyes scanning the rooftops and alleyways for shadows that didn't belong. Holt was a professional, but he wasn't the only threat. Graves had let me walk away with Spector's name, but his goodwill had an expiration date. The moment Rourke realized his house of cards was falling, everything would escalate. I stepped into my apartment and locked the door behind me, reinforcing it with a deadbolt I rarely used. Eric was sitting on the couch, eyes bloodshot, nursing a glass of cheap bourbon. "You were gone a while," he said without looking up. I tossed the duffel bag onto the coffee table. "Found this in Holt's storage unit," I said. Megan wasn't the only name on the list. Eric's gaze sharpened as he unzipped the bag, flipping through the surveillance photos. His expression hardened when he saw his own face staring back. "So, I was next," Eric muttered, setting the photos aside. "Looks that way," I replied, lowering myself into the chair across from him. Rourke wasn't leaving loose ends. Megan's insurance policy spooked him. Graves might have held the leash, but Spector was aiming for you. Eric downed the rest of his drink and set the glass aside with a heavy thud. "This isn't just about Megan anymore," he said quietly. "It's a goddamn purge."
I didn't disagree.
"This ends now," Eric said, voice tight with anger. "We take the evidence public. Rourke, Graves, all of them. Burn it all down." I shook my head. "You think the press is going to run with this?" I said. "Rourke's got half the city in his pocket. We give this to the wrong hands, and it disappears faster than Megan did." Eric narrowed his eyes. "So, what's your plan?" "Sit on this until Holt finishes the jobs." "No," I said. "We take the fight to Rourke directly." Eric scoffed. "You planning on knocking on his front door with a gun in your hand?" I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "We don't have to hit Rourke directly. We hit Graves." Eric frowned. "Graves is a middleman. Rourke's the head of the snake."
"Exactly," I said.
"Graves is the weak link. If we put him under enough pressure, he'll turn on Rourke to save his own skin. We use Graves to force Holt into the open, and then we finish this." Eric stared at me, weighing the plan in his head. "And if Graves doesn't crack?" I met his gaze. "Then he dies screaming." By the next morning, Eric and I were parked across the street from the Hollow. The club wasn't open yet, but Graves' black Escalade was parked out front. 2 of his men lingered by the entrance, smoking and laughing like nothing was wrong. I slipped my gun into the holster under my coat. "You sure about this?" Eric asked from the passenger seat. "No," I replied, pushing the door open. Eric followed, pulling his jacket tighter against the cold. We crossed the street, and the 2 men by the door straightened the moment they spotted me. "Club's closed," one of them grunted, stepping forward. "I'm not here for drinks," I said, flashing my badge. "Tell Graves he has company." The man frowned, clearly weighing his options. He glanced at his partner before pulling out his phone and stepping inside. A minute later, the door opened. "Graves will see you." The inside of the Hollow was dimly lit, the air heavy with stale cigar smoke. Graves sat at the bar, nursing a glass of bourbon that probably cost more than my car. He didn't look surprised to see me. "I thought we had an understanding, Kane," Graves said smoothly, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. I didn't sit. "We need to talk." Graves raised an eyebrow. "So, talk." I pulled one of the surveillance photos from my coat and set it on the bar. It showed Eric through the crosshairs of a rifle scope. Graves' smirk faded slightly. "This wasn't part of the deal," I said coldly. Graves glanced at the photo, then met my eyes. "I didn't authorize that." "Holt went rogue." I leaned in, lowering my voice. "Then give me Holt." Graves studied me for a long moment, tapping his glass thoughtfully. "I already gave you his name," he said. "I want more than a name," I snapped. "Where is he now?" Graves sighed. "You're not going to like the answer." I didn't blink. "Try me." Graves leaned closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "Holt's in the wind. But I know who's hiding him." Eric tensed beside me. "Rourke, I guessed." Graves nodded. "He's keeping Holt at one of his safe houses, out near the harbor. Tight security. If you're planning on making a move, you better be ready for a war." I straightened. "I'm always ready." Graves smirked faintly. Careful, Kane. You're playing a dangerous game. Holt isn't just a hired gun. He's Rourke's insurance policy. If you take him out, Rourke will come for you next. I turned to leave, but Graves' voice followed me. One last thing, Kane. I paused. When this is over, you and I are even. No more debts. I didn't look back. Noted. By nightfall, Eric and I were parked outside a shipping warehouse near the harbor. Graves' intel had been good. Holt was inside, guarded by 2 men at the entrance, and likely more inside. Eric tightened his grip on the gun resting in his lap. You ready for this? He asked. I nodded. No turning back now. We slipped out of the car, shadows against the cold steel of the harbor. Tonight it ended. The docks were deathly quiet as we closed in on the warehouse. The cold wind off the harbor gnawed at the edges of my coat, but the tension in the air burned hotter than any winter chill. Eric was on my left, Frank Delgado on my right. 2 men with everything to lose, following me into a storm none of us were prepared for. Holt was inside. We all knew it. The trick was getting to him before he disappeared for good. Frank took the lead, slipping through the shadows like he was born there. His time in the special ops world showed in how easily he moved. No wasted steps, no unnecessary noise. I covered him from a few paces back, gun drawn but held low. We approached the 2 guards stationed by the entrance. Their jackets marked them as Rourke's men, not Graves' usual lackeys. Eric glanced at me, mouthing, "What's the play?"
I didn't respond.
Instead, I stepped out of the shadows, gun raised. "Drop it," I called softly. The guards tensed, hands drifting toward their belts, but Frank was faster. His pistol coughed twice, silenced rounds snapping through the air. Both men crumpled, hitting the cold concrete without a sound. Eric swallowed hard, watching the bodies. "I thought we weren't killing anyone," he muttered. "We're not," Frank replied, kneeling to check pulses. "They're breathing. Sleep darts." I exhaled slowly. "Frank's not sloppy. If we start making bodies now, we'll never make it to Holt." Frank shot me a sideways grin.
See?
"The man knows how I work." Eric grunted, but didn't argue. We slipped inside the warehouse, stepping over the unconscious guards. The interior of the warehouse was dark, lit only by a few hanging bulbs that flickered weakly overhead. Stacks of wooden crates and rusted shipping containers loomed in every corner, the air thick with a scent of salt and motor oil. I scanned the area quickly. 3 more men lingered near the far end of the warehouse, talking in low tones. A metal staircase led up to a glass-paneled office overlooking the entire floor. The lights were on inside. "Holt." I could feel it. "Second floor," I whispered, gesturing with my gun. Frank nodded. "I'll deal with the ground floor. You 2 take the stairs." Eric glanced at me. "We're splitting up now."
He's got it, I said.
"Frank's more useful down here." Frank was already moving, sliding behind a row of crates. Eric and I made our way toward the staircase, keeping low and out of sight. The metal groaned faintly under our weight, but no one noticed. The guards below were too busy playing cards to look up. By the time we reached the landing, my pulse was hammering. Eric caught my eye, his hand tightening around his gun. "You ready for this?" I asked quietly. Eric nodded. "Let's end it." I pushed the office door open, stepping inside with my gun leveled. Nicholas Holt was sitting at the desk, casually disassembling a rifle with the ease of a man changing a light bulb. He didn't flinch when we entered. Instead, he glanced up, calm as ever. "Detective Kane," Holt said smoothly, setting the rifle down piece by piece. "I was wondering when you'd show up." I kept my aim steady. "Hands where I can see them, Holt." Holt smiled faintly, raising his hands just enough to comply, without looking like he cared.
"I'm not armed," he said.
Eric stepped forward, gun trembling slightly. "You killed Megan Whitfield." Holt tilted his head, as if considering the accusation. "I did," he admitted. "But I wasn't the one who pulled the trigger on your arrest, Eric. That was Rourke's call." Eric's jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought he might shoot Holt right there. "Lower the gun," I said softly, placing a hand on Eric's shoulder. "We need him alive." Eric took a breath, but didn't lower the weapon. Holt's eyes flicked toward me. You're wasting time, Kane. If you think killing me solves your work problem, you're mistaken. I'm just one cog in a much larger machine. That machine's breaking down, I replied. Holt smirked. We'll see. I gestured toward the desk with my gun. The folder. Hand it over. Holt reached down slowly, pulling out a thin, leather-bound file. He slid it across the desk without hesitation. What's in it? Eric asked. Names, Holt said. Accounts. Every dollar Rourke funneled through Vanguard Acquisitions. Megan had pieces of it. This is the rest. I flipped through the pages. It was all there, financial records, contracts signed by Rourke, and proof of offshore accounts tied directly to Spector's hits. This wasn't just evidence. It was a loaded gun pointed at Rourke's head. Why give this to us? I asked, narrowing my eyes. Holt shrugged. Because Rourke made a mistake. He put my name on the kill list, too. Eric's eyes widened. He tried to tie off his own hitman? Rourke doesn't like liabilities, Holt said with a cold smile. I figured I'd return the favor. The deal was made. Holt walked out of the safe house alive, but not without consequences. Graves' men would handle him, and Graves would make sure Rourke knew exactly who betrayed him. By morning, Rourke's house of cards had collapsed. The press was already circling, drawn by the financial records Eric leaked anonymously. Holt's dossier hit the papers like a bomb, exposing years of corruption that no amount of spin could undo.
Rourke vanished from the public eye.
Rumors swirled, private jets, offshore retreats. But I knew better. Graves didn't leave loose ends. As for Graves himself, his empire shrank, but he remained.
For now.
Eric walked free, his name cleared. Megan's legacy lived on through the chaos she left behind. But nothing about this felt like victory, because in the end, Graves was still breathing. And I wasn't done yet. Chapter 7. The Man in the Shadow. The fallout from Rourke's collapse was immediate and vicious. His name headlined every news outlet, plastered across screens like graffiti nobody could erase. Corruption.
Fraud.
Racketeering. The words were sharp, heavy enough to crack the foundation of every deal he'd built over the last decade. But beneath the noise, something quieter lingered. Graves. Vincent Graves had played the game better than anyone. He let Rourke burn while he stayed hidden, carefully stepping over the ashes like a man walking through a graveyard he helped fill. He was too smart to grab for the spotlight, but I knew Graves. He wouldn't be content with hiding forever. Sooner or later, he'd step out of the shadows. And when he did, I'd be waiting. Eric was pacing my apartment when I walked in that evening, his phone buzzing relentlessly with messages from reporters looking to tie him to the leaks. He ignored them all. Rourke's finished, Eric said, glancing up as I closed the door. But Graves. Still breathing, I muttered, shrugging off my coat. Eric's expression hardened. We can't let him walk away from this, Jack. I nodded, grabbing a glass from the kitchen. I know. But Graves isn't stupid. Rourke was a hammer, but Graves? He's the knife that slides between your ribs before you know you're bleeding. Eric slumped onto the couch, rubbing his temples. So, what's the plan? We can't exactly take him down with the press leak. He's too good at covering his tracks. I poured 2 fingers of scotch and set the glass on the table beside him. We don't take him down with press leaks. Eric raised an eyebrow. Then how? I took a slow sip, letting the burn settle. We cut him off at the knees. Eric frowned. I'm going to need more than metaphors, Jack. I sat down across from him, leaning forward. Graves built his empire by staying invisible, but every invisible man leaves footprints. If we can find his next move, his next play, we expose him before he solidifies his power. Eric stared at me for a long moment. And if we can't, I shrugged. Then we kill him. The room went quiet. Eric set his glass down carefully. You're serious?
I wasn't joking, I replied.
Eric exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. Jesus, Jack. This isn't a street brawl. Graves has connections. If we come at him like that, it won't be like Rourke, I interrupted. Graves won't leave room for mistakes. We have one shot at this, And I'm not waiting for him to draw first blood. Eric shook his head, but he didn't argue. He knew as well as I did, Graves wasn't the type to let sleeping dogs lie. I spent the next 3 days digging through the remnants of Rourke's operation, piecing together fragments Graves hadn't swept away yet. Bank records, property holdings, half-finished projects left in limbo after Rourke's fall. Graves hadn't taken ownership of any of it directly, but I recognized the pattern. He was consolidating power, absorbing Rourke's assets through shell companies hidden behind layers of proxies. The trail led me to a name I hadn't seen in years. Nina Alvarez. Nina wasn't a stranger. She was a corporate lawyer, the kind who didn't mind getting her hands dirty if the paycheck was big enough. I hadn't crossed paths with her since my early years on the force, back when she used to bail out mid-level criminals for Graves. If she was involved again, it meant Graves was planning something big. I found Nina at a high-end bar downtown, sipping a martini, like she owned the place. She saw me coming before I even reached the table. "Well, if it isn't Detective Kane," she said with a sly smile. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" I sat down across from her without asking. "We need to talk about Vincent Graves." Nina's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened slightly. "I handle a lot of clients, Jack. You'll have to be more specific." I leaned in, lowering my voice. "I know he's using you to clean up Rourke's mess. I want to know what he's planning." Nina swirled her drink, pretending to consider her answer. "You're stepping into dangerous territory," she said finally. "I'm already in it," I replied. "I just want to know where the ground falls out beneath me." Nina smirked, but there was no warmth behind it. "Graves doesn't trust easily," she said. "And he trusts people like me even less. But if you're asking if he's preparing for something," she paused, glancing around the room. "Yeah," I pressed. "He is, isn't he?" She met my eyes. "Graves is positioning himself, Jack. Rourke's fall left a vacuum. Graves plans to fill it." I clenched my jaw. "How soon?" "Soon," Nina said softly. "And when he does, it'll be quick."
Clean.
I leaned back, tapping my fingers on the table. "You know how this ends, Nina. Graves won't share power. If you think you're safe, you're wrong." Nina's eyes flickered, but she kept her expression cool. "I appreciate the concern," she said lightly. "But I know how to handle Graves." I rose from the table. "No, you don't. But you will." I left without looking back. By the time I returned to the precinct, the pieces had started clicking into place. Graves wasn't just taking over Rourke's assets. He was eliminating the competition. I laid out everything in front of Markham that evening. Bank records, property transfers, all of it pointed to one thing. Graves was rebuilding Vanguard under a new name. Markham rubbed his eyes, exhaling slowly. "Jesus, Kane. This isn't just corruption. Graves is trying to seize control of the entire system." I nodded. "Which is why we need to hit him now, before he solidifies his position." Markham leaned back, crossing his arms. "How do you propose we do that?" I slid a file across his desk. "We cut him off. His lawyers, his financial backers. We sever every tie he has until there's no one left to cover his tracks." Markham frowned, glancing through the folder. "And if that doesn't work?" he asked. I met his gaze without hesitation. "Then we bury him the old-fashioned way." The precinct was quiet when I left Markham's office, but the weight in my chest felt heavier than before. Graves wasn't just consolidating power. He was dismantling the competition piece by piece. I'd seen it before, back when he first rose under Rourke's shadow. Only this time, Rourke wasn't there to keep Graves on a leash. And if we didn't stop him now, there wouldn't be anyone left to challenge him. Eric was waiting outside the precinct, leaning against my car with his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. His eyes were red, but the fire behind them hadn't dimmed. "You get anything from Markham?" he asked as I approached.
"He's in," I said.
"But we're on our own for the groundwork." Eric nodded, shifting uneasily. "You think this'll work?" he asked quietly. I paused before unlocking the car. "It has to," I replied. "Or Graves walks away from this untouched, and we both know what happens if he does." Eric didn't argue. Back at my apartment, we laid out everything we had on Graves across the dining table. Surveillance photos, bank records, property transfers. But it wasn't enough. Graves had been smart. Everything was layered beneath proxies, hidden behind faceless corporations and ghost accounts. Nina Alvarez's legal maneuvering made sure no paper trail led directly back to him. Eric paced the room, frustrated. Graves knew we'd come after him, Eric muttered, glaring at the files. He's always 5 steps ahead. I stayed seated, sifting through Megan's notes, cross-referencing them with Rourke's files. That's when I saw it. A single address repeated across multiple documents, hidden among routine property acquisitions. Parkview Storage, Unit 18B. I frowned, tapping the paper. "What's this?" I muttered aloud. Eric leaned over, squinting at the address.
"I don't know," he said.
"Storage facility, maybe? One of Rourke's old stash houses." I flipped back through the earlier surveillance records. The same address popped up in a recent wire transfer. This time, the buyer listed was Vanguard's legal branch. The new one Graves had formed after Rourke fell. I stood abruptly, grabbing my coat. "We're checking it out." Eric hesitated. "Shouldn't we bring Markham's?" I shook my head.
"Not yet."
"Graves is careful, but he's not expecting us tonight. If we bring too much attention, we spook him." Eric grabbed his gun from the table. "Let's go." Parkview Storage sat at the edge of the industrial district, nestled between abandoned shipping yards and derelict factories. It looked like every other storage facility in the city, rundown, poorly lit, and half-forgotten by anyone who didn't have something to hide. By the time we arrived, the sun had long since set, leaving the facility bathed in flickering fluorescent lights. I killed the engine, watching the entrance from the cover of a nearby alley. "Think he's inside?" Eric asked, scanning the perimeter. "Graves wouldn't be," I replied. "But whatever he's keeping here is important enough to guard." Eric nodded toward the far end of the lot. "There," he whispered. A black sedan sat idling near the entrance to Unit 18B. 2 men stood nearby, smoking and keeping watch. Eric frowned. "Recognize them?" "Graves' men," I confirmed. "But if they're out here, it means the unit's not empty." Eric shifted nervously. "We're outnumbered." I glanced at the duffel bag in the back seat, the same one we'd taken from Holt's safe house. "We won't be for long." Frank Delgado met us outside the storage facility half an hour later. He leaned against his car, watching Graves' guards with the same cold detachment he always carried. "You boys sure know how to find trouble," Frank said, smirking as we approached. "You ready for this?" I asked. Frank patted the rifle slung beneath his coat. "Ready enough." Eric shifted nervously beside me. "This is insane." I ignored him, nodding to Frank. "We go in quiet. No casualties unless necessary." Frank chuckled. "Necessary's a flexible word." I shot him a look.
"Fine."
"No bodies," Frank relented. We approached from the south side, slipping between storage units to avoid the floodlights. The guards by the sedan hadn't noticed us yet, too busy laughing at something on one of their phones. Frank moved ahead, disappearing into the shadows. A few minutes later, there was a dull thud, followed by the soft shuffle of boots hitting concrete. Eric and I stepped around the corner. One guard was unconscious, his body slumped against the storage unit. Frank dragged the second guard behind a stack of pallets, dropping him unceremoniously. "Still breathing," Frank muttered.
"See?"
"No bodies." Eric exhaled shakily. I knelt beside the storage unit, examining the lock. It was new, too new for an old facility like this. "Graves isn't hiding junk in here," I muttered, pulling a set of lockpicks from my coat. It took less than a minute. The lock clicked, and the heavy door slid open. Inside, the storage unit was bare except for a single metal cabinet. It looked out of place, military-grade, the kind designed to survive fires, floods, and bullets. Eric stepped inside cautiously, gun raised. Frank followed, keeping watch at the entrance. I knelt by the cabinet, running my fingers along the edges. A keypad sat on the side, waiting for a code. Eric crouched beside me. "You think Megan had the combination?"
"No," I said.
"But Graves did." I punched in a number. Rourke's birthday. The cabinet clicked open. Inside were stacks of black ledgers, flash drives, and folders filled with signatures I recognized immediately. Rourke's files. But they weren't just old records. They were graves, too. Every dirty deal. Every bribe. Every piece of evidence Megan had been hunting and more. Eric whistled softly. Jesus, Jack. This isn't just leverage. This is a death sentence. Frank glanced over his shoulder. Then let's get out of here, before someone notices. I nodded, stuffing the contents into a duffel bag. As we stepped outside, I heard footsteps. Frank drew his weapon. A shadow emerged from the darkness, followed by a familiar voice. Well, well. I guess I shouldn't be surprised. Vincent Graves stood at the edge of the lot, hands in his pockets. He wasn't alone. And he wasn't smiling.